Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's beg. Darkness of the Colosseum, in the deep heart of ancient Rome, at the boundary between civilization and savagery, stood the Colosseum, a grand amphitheater that witnessed endless battles, bloodshed, and terrifying rituals. But behind the stone walls, under the midday sun, legend spoke of another, darker reality lurking. It was a time when the emperor, commanding a vast army, had absolute power over the life and death of his subjects, and all of it played out on the arena where the fate of many was decided. Yet, even the emperors and gladiators were unaware that in the shadow of this great structure, something beyond death was awakening. The roar of applause and the cries of the crowd began to fade as the next fighter stepped onto the arena. Everyone expected what had become ordinary, a spectacular fight, death, and fear. However, today, within this massive structure that could hold tens of thousands, something strange was happening. That day, an ordinary battle turned into something horrific. A dark cloud descended into the depths of the amphitheater, where almost all the fighting sectors were usually kept. It was not just a cloud. It was the embodiment of evil, long forgotten by the memory of all people. It appeared in the sky the moment the gladiators entered the arena. One of them, a dark-skinned warrior named Cassius, felt it first. His heart pounded, his hands trembled, even though he was always calm and confident before a fight. That time, feeling the cold wind that cut through his bones, he could not understand what was happening. It was as if everything was submerged in an anxiety that had no physical form. The Colosseum was changing. Darkness slowly covered the arena. Fearing it was a sign of a great storm, the emperor dared not interrupt the fight. Panic began to spread through the crowd. No one could understand what was happening, but one thing was clear. The events of this day had nothing to do with the usual gladiatorial combat. Suddenly, from the darkness that had overtaken the Colosseum, several figures emerged, looking not like ordinary people, but more like visions. Their eyes burned with a red light, and their faces were clouded, as if covered in ancient dust. These beings, resembling humans but with sinister traits, began to move among the gladiators. One of them, wearing a massive black mask, approached Cassius. "Do you not know why you're here?" whispered the masked warrior, though it did not sound like ordinary words. His voice was laced with a coldness that caused pain in Cassius's head. Cassius could not take his eyes off these creatures. These entities had not appeared by accident. They belonged to ancient gods, forgotten even by the oldest priests. The gods were forgotten, but not dead. And now, as the Colosseum gathered its gladiators and slaves began to die for amusement, these gods returned to reclaim what was once theirs. Gladiators began to disappear. First, they fell one by one, and then they simply vanished, like shadows in the darkness. The people in the stands didn't understand what was happening. They looked at the arena, where there were no longer any familiar fights. Instead, the Colosseum had become an arena of death they could not have imagined in their worst nightmares. Blood no longer flowed in rivers. It was absorbed by the earth, and only dust and the smell of death filled the air. The masked creatures did not merely destroy the gladiators. They took them captive, stealing their souls. And each soul became a part of their power. In the moment when Cassius, too weak to fight, fell to his knees, one of these creatures appeared before him. It raised its hand, and in its gaze, there was not only pain but also an infinite emptiness. "You will be part of us, and we will take your soul to the arena so you will become part of this circle of death," said the creature, and its voice carried a promise of endless fear. But even then, the Colosseum did not cease its terrifying spectacle. A deeper darkness fell beneath the ground, and in every corner of this monumental place, other entities stirred, ready to claim their servants. In the heart of the Colosseum, blood no longer flowed. Now the souls of those who stepped on the cursed land were consumed. Would anyone remain who could break this cycle? Would every spectator become part of this dark spiral? This is only the beginning of a story that will be kept in the mouths of those who survive. And only questions will remain. Can we escape the curse, or has it long since taken us into its dark embrace? Thunder rumbled in the distance as the Colosseum sank deeper and deeper into darkness. The cries of gladiators, disappearing one by one, were muffled. Instead, strange, alien sounds filled the air, like the sighs of forgotten spirits, the rustling of shadows creeping across the ground. The air grew heavy, grim. Everyone still alive felt an unfathomable fear tightening their chests. But the most terrifying thing was the silence that enveloped the Colosseum after each fall. A silence that spoke more than any scream. Cassius knelt, losing strength, feeling as if the darkness was consuming him. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. He was no longer who he had been before. Those beings that had entered this world didn't just kill. They changed people, transforming them into parts of their eternal mechanism. The gods, long gone, returned not to destroy the world, but to reshape it, turning everyone into endless cycles of pain and suffering. At that moment, one of the creatures appeared before him again. It stood right in front of him, its red eyes blazing like a fire that would never be extinguished. Its mask shattered into pieces, and Cassius saw that behind it was not just a face, but something older and more terrifying. This was not simply a god. This was a memory, an ancient evil that held the fate of not just this place but all of Rome in its hands. "You did not respect death," the creature said in a ghastly, raspy voice, which sounded more like an echo. "And now you will become part of it, just like all these people. But you still have a chance. You can become strong like us. You can become one of us." But Cassius felt his spirit rebel against this. All his life, fights, battles, experiences, none of it had been for the purpose of becoming one of these dark beings. He rejected its offer, even if only for a moment. At that moment, one of the dark figures drew closer, and he saw how its body shifted, turning into a shadow that moved with strange speed. All the other gladiators and gods sacrificed had now become parts of this invisible yet powerful entity. And in the darkness, Cassius understood, he was on the brink of his end. This was not just a trial, it was oblivion. But suddenly, amid the chaos, when everything around him was drowning in shadow and the screams of the fallen had turned silent, a patch of light appeared. Though he could not see clearly, Cassius felt that something was changing. It was not a dark shadow, but something familiar to him from ancient times, the legend of an ancient god who opposed the darkness. The mass of light mixed with the shadows, struggling against them. It seemed that in this moment, when the entire Colosseum was consumed by fear and pain, the last hope for salvation appeared. Rome, this great city, had long held firm on its glory and strength. And now, on the edge of destruction, he, Cassius, could be part of this salvation. "You, who decide who is strong and who is weak. You, who once fought for honor, must now fight for life," said a voice that echoed from the heart of the Colosseum. The shadow began to melt away, but not as quickly as Cassius had hoped. He understood that he could not stop this tide alone. To defeat it, he needed to unite the forces of those who remained alive. But who else was alive? Everyone around him had either been transformed into part of the darkness or perished. The creatures that devoured souls gave no chance even to those who sought to survive. And now, he was the only one with a chance to stop this evil. But how? How could he, an ordinary gladiator, stand against this when everything around him was changing before his eyes? Cassius made his decision. He knew he could break the cycle. But to do so, he had to return to the very beginning, in the depths of the Colosseum where it all started. And as he made his way toward the dark catacombs of the amphitheater, the final battle awaited him. A battle not with those he could see, but with what remained beyond his consciousness. Thus began the final battle of the Colosseum. The last struggle not for life, but for the salvation of the world from the dark forces that sought to conquer it. Cassius descended into the dark catacombs of the Colosseum, where there was neither light nor sound, only the smell of dampness and oblivion. The noise that accompanied the battles in the arena was far above, while here only silence reigned, deadly and ominous. He felt the cold seeping into his bones, as if each step threatened to be his last. But he did not stop. A fury burned in his heart, a desire to destroy everything in his path, and it was his only salvation. He didn't know what awaited him in the depths of these dark tunnels. One thing, however, was clear. These catacombs were not made for humans. They were a place for something much older, something that existed long before the first myths of Rome emerged. All this darkness, all this emptiness, was part of a vast mechanism that had been working for thousands of years, devouring anyone who dared to approach. Suddenly, a vast hall opened before him. It was empty, but the air was heavy, as if it were filled with something, and the walls seemed alive, as though they could breathe. And there, in the midst of this terrifying place, he saw what all those who had come here had been searching for: a massive monolith, covered in ancient symbols, emanating a faint red glow. Cassius felt a chill run down his spine, realizing that this was not just a stone, but something far worse. It was the heart of the curse that held the Colosseum in its grip. From its red symbols, a strange sound began to emerge, like the scraping of metal, and as though from the very bowels of this stone structure, a grotesque creature surfaced. It was not just a shadow, but an entity composed of darkness and death, and in its dark eyes burned a fire that could never be extinguished. It was not one, but parts of something greater, a terrible god, awakening after thousands of years of oblivion. The creature slowly approached Cassius, its horrific hands stretching like tree roots, and with each step, the ground beneath him seemed to try to swallow him into its depths. Cassius felt his heart race, but fear did not paralyze him. He knew that now, it was either him or the monster standing before him that would die. His hands clenched the sword, and he charged into battle. But before he could land the first blow, the creature tore its soul from the darkness, and Cassius felt its ominous power pierce him. He felt his body fill with cold, his lungs constrict, and his arms and legs became heavy, as if made of lead. His consciousness began to blur, and he saw before him images of himself falling into the darkness, including his old battles, his death, and the deaths of those he had once loved. This was not just a battle. It was the beginning of transformation. All who entered the catacombs of the Colosseum became parts of this shadow, which rooted itself in every cell of their bodies. They became its part, and their souls left the physical world forever. And now Cassius was on the brink of this horrific transformation. But something strange happened. His consciousness did not break. He felt his will begin to fight the darkness, as if he were tearing himself from its grasp. He made one final lunge and struck one of the dark limbs of the creature with his sword. But this did not end it. It only smiled at him with a sinister grin that was more than just a face. It was the smile of evil itself, which resided in its heart. "You cannot stop us," the creature whispered, its voice like the rustle of a needle tearing through the air. "We are not just the forces of darkness. We are those who came from the world of forgotten gods. You are now part of us, and this cannot be changed." The darkness once again engulfed Cassius, and for a moment, he felt his body melt away, his soul dissolving within it. But suddenly, as if from the very depths of fear itself, he heard a voice. It was not the creature's voice, but the voice of that legend, that ancient god who had tried to reverse everything. And on this path, Cassius had one task: to break free from this trap, to become the one who could stop this dark force, or to become part of it. The darkness that consumed the Colosseum knew no mercy. And now, there was only one question left. Would he be able to defeat it, or would this darkness become the new world for all who had ever walked the land of Rome? The darkness consumed everything around him, and every step Cassius took echoed in his body with a coldness that penetrated to his very heart. The creature standing before him was not just a physical horror. It was part of a great evil that had long concealed itself in the darkness of this place. It knew that Cassius could not escape, that even his will could not cope with the forces trying to destroy everything that remained of his human essence. "You will not be able to defeat us, gladiator," its voice echoed in his head like the reverberation of an ancient nightmare. "We have already taken the souls of all who have stepped upon this land. You are just like all the others who fought. You are worse." But Cassius did not hear this. His eyes burned with rage, with a thirst for vengeance. With his last strength, he lunged forward and struck his sword into the darkness. The creature's screams filled the air, but for a moment, it vanished, leaving only a loud, piercing sound that tore through the air. And suddenly, just when it seemed to have disappeared, it emerged again, but now with an even more terrifying force. Cassius didn't even have time to take a step. The creature ripped the sword from his hands, and he felt its dark hand seize his neck, choking him so tightly that his lungs began to burn from the lack of air. He desperately tried to break free, but the dark force wouldn't release him. And then he saw it. Amid the darkness, more figures appeared. They resembled humans, but their faces were not those of the living. They were twisted, soulless shells that had once been gladiators, slaves, and warriors who fought in the Colosseum. Now they had become part of these dark creatures. One of them Cassius recognized. It was Titus, his old companion who had died in the arena years ago. His eyes were hollow, and his body was nothing more than a creepy shadow that wandered around. Titus groaned and approached Cassius, draining the last of his strength. And he saw how the rest of the figures moved toward him. They were faceless, but their movements were quick and decisive. Each of them possessed boundless strength, and each was part of the dark force that had enslaved the Colosseum. One by one, they tore from Cassius everything that was still alive, absorbing his soul into themselves. Cassius felt his body slowly dissolve, his consciousness merging with those who had already become part of this nightmare. They were mutilated shadows, hunting him, mocking his fears. It was all like an endless nightmare that had no end. Through the darkness that consumed him, he saw images. Gladiators who fought for honor, falling one by one. Slaves who died in horrific conditions. Warriors who gave their lives to enter the world of glory. And in the end, Rome itself, suffering from its own cruelty. And each of these shadows that walked among him was part of this terrifying cycle. One by one, those who remained alive began to fall. Cassius could do nothing, and with each new movement, these creatures grew stronger. Every battle in the arena, every killing, every dying scream fueled them with even more power. They began to annihilate everyone who remained alive, and the Colosseum became their eternal battleground, where only death and fear had the right to exist. Amid this chaos and death, Cassius felt his body begin to vanish. And although his soul still fought, it could no longer return. He became part of this endless circle of blood and pain, part of the dark force that filled the Colosseum. And then, when all the shadows gathered once more into one dreadful mass, the horrible piercing sound rang out again. The Colosseum became once more a place of endless cruelty and suffering. The creatures that emerged from the darkness were now stronger than anyone who ever had even a sliver of human will. "This world no longer belongs to you," one of the creatures whispered, its eyes burning, and its voice barely audible. "It belongs to us, and it belongs to death." And at that moment, Cassius finally understood that there was no place for victory. This was not just a place. It was the very essence of the curse that consumed everyone who approached this place. And he, along with all the others, became part of this horrifying, merciless world, where death was only the beginning of the end. The Colosseum was a place of relentless death, where there was no longer any room for redemption, where all that remained was suffering and painful existence in the shadow. And those who entered could never break free. The darkness that engulfed Cassius grew deeper with every moment, turning him into a part of this endless nightmare. The Colosseum, with its majestic walls and arches, had now become a place of eternal struggle, of eternal pain. Every strike, every scream, every drop of blood spilled on the arena became part of a dark ritual that consumed the souls of all who dared step onto the land of this dreadful arena. Cassius felt his body gradually losing its human form. His muscles no longer obeyed, his body turning to stone, yet his soul seemed to still exist, though immersed in a soulless stream of horror. He became one of those who no longer had a past or a future. His essence was an empty shell that moved in the darkness, knowing neither purpose nor end. Images began to appear in Cassius's eyes, those who had died before him. Gladiators, slaves, warriors who fought for glory or freedom, and now their souls had become part of this endless cycle of death. They were all like him, dead inside, yet still forced to serve the dark forces of this cursed place. Their hands could not stop the darkness. Their voices could no longer scream. And then, before him, as if from nothing, another figure appeared. It was entirely black, but strange red lights flickered from its back, burning like the eyes of the evil that had long awoken. This was yet another part of the Colosseum, its death, now set free to claim its next victim. Cassius tried to move, but his body was too heavy. With every motion, he felt his soul being further consumed by this ominous place, how it sucked the remnants of his humanity from him. He saw the other fallen gladiators moving nearby, their eyes hollow, but in each one there was something terrible, an understanding that they would never be free again. The black figure before him took a step forward, and this time, Cassius felt no fear. He realized that this was the moment of final end, the moment when everything would end. But he was not alone. In this darkness, he saw the images of those who had helped him, the images of those he loved, and now he was with them, for there was no more room for despair. They had all become part of this circle, this endless circle of blood and suffering that filled the Colosseum. The figure moved closer, and with each step, Cassius felt his own existence dissolving in the shadow. The darkness consumed him completely, and when he finally felt he no longer had the strength to fight, he surrendered to this evil, which had long become a part of him. His body was no longer a body, but an empty vessel for the dark power now using him as an instrument for new victims. And with every new step of the dark figure, Cassius felt his heart stop beating. He became part of this endless nightmare, where no soul could ever escape. And when the darkness consumed his last thought, his last wish, he realized that he no longer existed, and that was his end. The Colosseum became the final resting place for anyone who had ever killed or been killed here. And when the sounds of battle ceased, when there was no one left who could scream or fight, the Colosseum sank into silence. But this was no ordinary silence. It was the silence of eternal hell, where no sound could penetrate, where only shadows and darkness reigned forever. And now, when everyone had become part of this cursed place, the Colosseum was no longer just an arena for combat. It became a merciless prison for the souls that had died in its arena, a prison with no exit, no end. And the shadow that covered Rome was more than just death. It was the very essence of fear, which lives in each of us, and it remained here forever. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.